I ended our last lecture by talking about how post-war prosperity had begun under the administration of Harry Truman, and how the presidents after FDR had a much more powerful role to play in managing this prosperous economy. In fact, all of the economies after World War II, after the Great Depression, were managed by the government. That doesn't mean that they controlled the economy as much as they used the power of the state to tweak the economy and to try to minimize, through management and regulation, the ups and the downs of economies, the expansions and the contractions. And for the most part, they were reasonably successful. Now, you know, you can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think, and it's impossible, of course, to argue a negative. That is, what would have happened if there had not been government intervention in the economy. But there is a record of substantially lighter contraction of the economy than there had been in the 19th and early 20th century after World War II. That may have been natural, and the government intervention may have been a problem in and of itself, and it may, I mean, again, you don't know what happened, what would have happened had the situation been different. Nevertheless, what we want to look at now are a couple of presidents and their domestic agenda, and how those things impacted or were caused by this prosperity in the economy. Now, we've already talked about President Dwight D. Eisenhower and President John F. Kennedy in their foreign policy, which has traditionally been under the control of the presidents. Now, it's more under the control of presidents now than it used to be. But the presidents have always been the point of the spear, you might say, on foreign policy. But in the mid to late 20th century, then we find them also intervening again to a significant way in the economy. And the first of these presidents to take the ball and run with it was not Harry Truman, but Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, this is a survey class, so we can't go deeply into Eisenhower. There's been a lot of revisionism about Eisenhower's presidency. The orthodox view used to be, at least, that he was kind of a Calvin Coolidge-like president, a lot more charming than Coolidge, but kind of a do-nothing president. But the revisionists make a pretty convincing case, I'm not completely convinced by it, that he was a watchful, waiting president, that he only intervened when he thought that he needed to intervene. However, coming on the heels of Truman and FDR and even Hoover, Ike, which is what everybody called him and still calls him now, probably appeared to be less involved than he actually was. This is a matter of perception rather than reality. And I think that it's going to take a few more years, a couple more generations of historians to really ferret out, separate the wheat from chaff, you might say, about the story of Eisenhower. He called his own approach to domestic policy, quote unquote, dynamic conservatism. So his domestic policy we refer to as dynamic conservatism. He wanted to move forward, but at the same time he wanted to conserve. Particularly, he was fiscally, he considered himself to be a businessman and an administrator rather than a visionary. He imposed business principles and practices in government management. For example, he is the president who created the White House staff and the chief of staff. He was considered a fiscal conservative and considered himself one, which is a business principle. and he proposed a tax reduction in 1954 that, when enacted, actually had the perverse effect of leading to an almost immediate recession. It actually took money out of the economy and did not replace it with goods and services. It didn't move money where it was supposed to move money, and it failed. And in fact, one of the reasons for Richard Nixon's paper-thin, razor-thin loss to John Kennedy in the 1960 election was because of the Eisenhower recession. Now, this wasn't a particularly bad recession, but it was aggravating and long-term, and it slowed growth from the dramatic growth in the economy that had occurred during and after World War II. Eisenhower retained much of the New Deal. He even retained something of a focus, though his tax reduction would belie that, on Keynesian demand-side economics. And he certainly did want to keep programs like Social Security, and made kind of a big deal about not touching that third rail of Social Security because it would electrocute whoever did it in government. He believed in a certain level of government intervention when it was good for the national economy. He normally wanted to intervene in the economy by creating infrastructure. Now, this came from Eisenhower's long reign as chief of the European theater. He understood the need for infrastructure. He helped to develop and provided U.S. Intervention in the St. Lawrence Seaway, which, though it is mostly in Canada, connected the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean. And so that improved the ability of goods to move out of the Great Lakes. He inaugurated the limited access interstate highway system in 1956 with his promotion of the 1956 Federal Road Aid Act, or Federal Highway Act. He also wanted to provide civilian uses for military projects. Now, some of this was a continuation of Truman. Some of it was his own concoction, and much of it was knowing that civilians would object to military-only development. He promoted the concept that the military could develop certain things if there was a civilian use for them, and if civilians were allowed to develop those uses. Not so much civilians as the government would assist in the development of civilian uses of things like, for example, atomic energy. He promoted the development of the Atomic Energy Commission and the expansion of the Atomic Energy Commission, and focused it not on controlling the development of bombs, so that would be the military, but on creating civilian use for atomic energy. Everything from the use of radioactive isotopes in cancer and other disease cures, but also in radioactive imaging for health services, and the use of atomic energy for production of electricity. He promoted the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958 as the civilian equivalent of the Army and Navy missile programs. That would be intercontinental ballistic missiles that reached beyond the atmosphere into inner space in order to deliver military payloads. What did he want to deliver? He wanted to deliver satellites and a manned space program. And it's under Eisenhower that NASA creates the manned space program that would be picked up by Kennedy and picked up by Johnson and Nixon, and eventually would land people on the moon and would help create the International Space Station, and would help or would continue dramatic research into even today. NASA is still with us. And one of the most significant achievements of the Eisenhower administration in the economy is the National Defense Education Act, proposed by an Alabama legislator, Carl Elliott from Jasper, Alabama, and who's a Democrat, but picked up by many people across both parties who thought that this was a very important thing to do, especially since right before 1958, that is in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite into space, Sputnik, scaring the dickens out of us and making us feel like we were behind in space technology. So the National Defense Education Act paid schools to take graduate students into engineering and sciences that could be used in defense and space programs. Now, we don't know, it's hard to say that Ike's programs caused this economic boom between 1950 and 1960. They were certainly part and parcel of the boom, even with a fiscal recession in the middle of his administration that lasted into the Kennedy administration. We find that there was this overall boom between 1950 and 1960 measured by the regular decennial census. Gross national product doubled between 1950 and 1960. This was fueled by cheap oil and by the so-called military-industrial complex. That is the research and development of these military systems that were part of Eisenhower's foreign policy and his new look military, more bang for the buck, which meant fewer ground troops, but more technology. That is, defense industries came online and fueled a lot of this development. Now, cheap energy fueled this development as well. Ike warned of the military-industrial complex in his farewell address in 1961, but it was really Eisenhower that had built the military-industrial complex to 1961. Another thing that promoted this economic boom was consumerism, that old pent-up demand that people still felt. For example, 75% of all U.S. households owned an automobile by 1960, and 87% owned televisions by 1960, though televisions hadn't really come onto the market until the mid-1950s. TV program had gone commercial immediately. That it had started out with these highfalutin notions that TV would be a boon to education and would be culturally uplifting. Nah, that didn't happen. Junk appeared immediately, and the craziest kind of junk appeared for sheer entertainment purposes, almost vaudevillian, in the way that TV appealed to the mass market rather than to niche markets. This had a tremendous homogenizing effect, like we had discussed in our discussion of the society of the 1920s. And it again, like radio and like movies, promoted the value of large urban areas as culturally normative. That is, how were you supposed to act? Well, your parents and your local institutions might suggest you act one way, but television suggested that you act potentially that same way or potentially a very different way. And programming did have an overall influence on how people considered life to be led. Well, we also find that that home ownership expanded so that 60% of families in America owned homes by 1960. Now, many of these were in suburbia, which was made possible by federal highway funding and by the Americans' desire to own property as well as to flee inner cities. Low interest loans made possible in part by by the GI Bill and by other federal agencies also provided this impetus to home ownership in suburbia. Consequently, this economic boom created what we think of as the American dream. The American dream in the 19th century really wasn't so much about expanding your pocketbook, though that was part of it. There was this streets of gold concept that many immigrants brought with them. But the American dream in the 19th century had been a combination of seeking freedom and high wages that could be sent back home. But the 1950s American dream, which many of us still consider to be the American dream today, 60 years later, is that you can attain a middle-class lifestyle with all of the trappings of the middle class. That is, home ownership, the possession of sufficient goods and services to signify that you are in the middle class. That was part and parcel of this 1950s economic boom. And it was quite a change from the previous concept of the American dream. Well, with the boom of the economy through 1960, let's move into the presidential administration of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, who called his domestic program the New Frontier. Now, the New Frontier was principally campaign rhetoric from his 1960 campaign, and many of his proposals were not well thought out and were actually fairly weak. Kennedy, who many liberals consider to be the founder of modern liberalism, really wasn't all that liberal, and he really wasn't so active as he appeared to be active. There's a lot more symbolism to Kennedy than there is actual substance to Kennedy. Now, I have no brief for Kennedy one way or another. I think the whole Camelot business was ginned up by Theodore White and Jackie Kennedy at JFK's demise in November of 1963. And I bring to bear Theodore White's autobiography, in which he says this was ginned up by Jackie Kennedy and me to kind of make sense and even exploit Kennedy's tragic assassination. What would Kennedy have done in a second term, which he probably would have won fairly easily? It's hard to say. He was definitely moving toward economic and race liberalism, and he had an extraordinarily muscular foreign policy. In fact, it was his foreign policy and his promise of getting out of the recession that the U.S. had been in that really gave him the slim margin of victory over Richard Nixon. He's also very telegenic. The TV loved him, and the 1960 campaign was the first televised campaign. Nixon looked awful on TV. He wouldn't allow them to use makeup, and so he looked like he was washed out. Nixon also had a very heavy beard, and even if he shaved 2 or 3 times a day, he always looked scruffy, and that just looked on TV awful. He also had a tendency, when under pressure, to sweat on his upper lip, and television picked that up. Now, makeup would have cured all of that, but he did not want makeup, and he ended up shooting himself in the foot in style over substance. But making the election very close, however. Okay, so Kennedy won the 1960 election, and in 1961 inaugurated his New Frontier proposals. He proposed a war on poverty, having read Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, principally about inner cities and Appalachia. Said there's just like Jacob Riis's 1890, How the Other Half Lives, here was this hidden set of groups in America who had not participated in post-war prosperity. So how do we fix it? Do we have a moral imperative to fix it? And Kennedy said yes. And so he proposed some weak, not well thought out war on policy proposals that went nowhere in Congress. He proposed health insurance for the elderly and federal aid to education, again, which went nowhere in Congress until after his assassination, in which they become part of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Now, Kennedy failed in these proposals, but Kennedy succeeded in other proposals. He enjoyed some success after 1962 with a proposed tax cut to stimulate the economy. Now, this was different from the kind of from the tax cut that Eisenhower had allowed to pass in 1954, which was untargeted, and so actually it was primarily on capital gains, and it was just a tax cut for tax cut's sake, and it ended up taking money out of the economy. Now, this tax cut was supposed to stimulate the economy. The context was very different, and it was to combat the ongoing recession. Now, the centerpiece of the 1964 tax cut, which Reagan supporters always look back on to claim that Kennedy was a supply sider. He was not. This was a demand stimulative proposed in 1962 to reduce the marginal rates. The highest marginal rate would drop from from 91% down to 65%, and the lowest marginal rate would drop from 25% to 14%. That is, there was a range that was collected on income taxes. That is, the income tax range set in World War II, because the government needed lots of money, ranged from 25% to 91%. Kennedy proposed lowering that whole range to 14 to 65%. Most of this fell onto the lower tax brackets and it pumped a bunch of money into the hands of people that would not spend it on luxury goods or put it into the stock market, but would spend it on consumer goods. And this indeed, after this was finally passed in 1964, after Kennedy died, did stimulate the economy pretty dramatically, in fact. He also proposed urban renewal and had some success with that. Downtown cores had been faltering for 15 or 20 years and had been crumbling, and he provided grants to renew downtown areas. Now, there can be a big battle over this about gentrification, but he did enjoy some success. Two of his most successful programs for the New Frontier was the Peace Corps, which was created as part of his foreign policy as well as domestic policy in 1961, and had as its mission to promote understanding between individual Americans and people in developing countries, because the Peace Corps would send Americans, volunteers who received a small stipend, to these foreign countries for a 2-year stint. It also assisted these developing countries by providing technical assistance and technical resources in order to help them develop infrastructure or education. And so it benefited people all around and was a much softer approach to foreign policy. Plus, and this is probably why Kennedy is seen as such a visionary by so many people, was because this was very different than the kind of hard-edged military confrontational diplomacy of the past 35 or 40 years. It's a very different take. In addition to the Peace Corps, another significant program was the manned space program.
particularly the flight to the moon. Now, Kennedy seriously proposed going to the moon in 1962 and began the Apollo program with NASA in order to get to the moon. We had the Mercury program, a single astronaut being launched into space, the Gemini program, 2 astronauts in a capsule, and then the Apollo program, which would launch 3 astronauts into space in an attempt to get to the moon. Kennedy proposed this seriously in November of 1962, and eventually under Richard Nixon, we would accomplish this in July of 1969. I know that some of you listening to this lecture are saying, no, that never happened. It was all bogus and nonsense. I disagree, but we'll leave it at that. Anyway, we see that over the course of the administrations of Eisenhower and Kennedy, that presidents either helped create or used the burgeoning prosperity of the economic boom between 1950 and 60 to launch programs. Some of them, like Eisenhower's, created infrastructure. Others dramatically used goodwill and technology to enhance or expand the economy and enhance the presence of the United States, both at home and around the world. This concludes our lecture, and I thank you as usual.